A millionaire spots a homeless woman on a park bench, huddled with three identical little girls. At first, it's just another passing sight, until she lifts her head, and his world shatters. 12 years ago, she was the love of his life. Now she's destitute, struggling to survive with three daughters who share his piercing blue eyes. He never knew she was pregnant. He never knew they existed. But the real shock? She tried to find him, and someone made sure she never could. As painful truths come to light, one question remains. Will he fight for the family he never knew he had, or lose them forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. Apollo Reed stood at the edge of the construction site, his Italian leather shoes gathering dust as he surveyed what would soon become the Beacon, his most ambitious luxury development yet. Boston's skyline stretched behind him, the afternoon sun glinting off glass towers he'd helped build over the past decade. "We're ahead of schedule on the foundation work," said Marcus, his project manager, flipping through schematics on his tablet. The environmental assessment came back clean. Apollo nodded, only half listening. At 34, he had everything his younger self had once dreamed of: a thriving company, properties across 3 states, and the respect of Boston's business elite. Yet the accomplishment felt hollow, like decorating rooms in a house with no one to share them with. "Mr. Reed?" Marcus prompted. "Sorry, the drainage system, you were saying." "Yes, we've redesigned it to exceed code requirements." The Planning Commission was impressed. Apollo ran his hand along the temporary fencing. "Good. I want this building to be perfect." Perfect for whom? The question nagged at him as it often did lately. Wealthy foreign investors, young tech executives, the faceless tenants who would pay premium rents for harbor views never seemed quite real to him. "We should wrap up for today," Apollo said, checking his watch. "I need to review the interior design proposals before tomorrow's meeting." As Marcus gathered his things, Apollo walked the perimeter of the property alone. The late September breeze carried a hint of autumn, reminding him of college days at MIT, of walking across campus with fallen leaves crunching underfoot and a particular hand clasped in his. Julia Winters. The name surfaced unbidden, as it sometimes did when his guard was down. Around 6 years had passed since they'd parted ways, yet certain memories remained vivid, her chestnut hair catching sunlight as she bent over architectural drawings, her infectious laugh, the passionate debates they'd had about ethical urban development. Their romance had been intense, the brilliant scholarship girl from a modest background, and the business major with family connections. For 2 years, they'd been inseparable, planning a future where his business acumen and her architectural vision would transform skylines together. Until that terrible night when everything fell apart, when misunderstandings and his father's interference had created a gulf neither could cross. Apollo shook his head, banishing the memories. He'd made his choices. She'd made hers. "The contractor wants to know about the marble for the lobby," Marcus said, returning to his side. "Italian or domestic?" "Italian," Apollo replied automatically. "Nothing but the best for the Beacon." They walked toward the street where Apollo's car waited, discussing final plans for the site. The small park across from the property had recently been renovated, another tick in the box for property values. Apollo glanced over, his eyes scanning the new benches and carefully planted trees. That's when he saw them. A woman sat on a bench, 3 small girls clustered around her. Even from a distance, the children were obviously identical, same height, same dark hair pulled into neat ponytails, same blue coats that had seen better days. The woman was speaking to them, her head bent attentively as she appeared to be helping them with something. Homework, perhaps. Apollo wouldn't have looked twice, except something about her posture, the graceful tilt of her head, struck a chord of familiarity. She tucked a strand of long chestnut hair behind her ear, a gesture so achingly familiar that Apollo stopped mid-stride. "Mr. Reed?" Marcus questioned. Apollo barely heard him. The woman looked up, perhaps sensing his stare, and even across the distance of the street and park, their eyes met. The world tilted on its axis. "Julia." The name escaped his lips in a whisper. It was impossible, yet undeniable. Those were the same intelligent eyes that had once looked at him with love, now widened with shock at seeing him. Her face was thinner, marked by evident hardship, but unmistakably Julia Winters. The backpack beside her, the worn edges of the children's clothing, the careful way they shared what looked like a single sandwich. The reality of her situation hit him like a physical blow. Julia was homeless, with 3 little girls who looked about 8 years old. Apollo's heart hammered against his ribs as an impossible calculation formed in his mind. "Sir, are you all right?" Marcus's voice seemed to come from miles away. Apollo couldn't finish the sentence. Across the distance, Julia had gathered the children closer, her protective stance speaking volumes. She hadn't looked away, seeming as frozen by the recognition as he was. 5 years since they'd parted. 3 identical little girls who looked about 5 years old, with startlingly familiar blue eyes. His eyes. The ground seemed to shift beneath Apollo's feet as the world he thought he knew crumbled and reformed around this single, life-altering revelation. Apollo's legs moved before his mind could catch up. Crossing the street toward the park, he barely registered Marcus calling after him. His entire focus narrowed to Julia and the 3 little girls huddled around her. Julia spotted him approaching. Her eyes widened with recognition and something else. Fear. She hurriedly gathered the children's few belongings, stuffing papers into a worn backpack. "Come on, girls, we need to go," she said, her voice carrying on the autumn breeze. "But Mom, we just got here," one of the triplets protested. "Now, Sophie," Julia insisted, helping the girls to their feet. They had taken only a few steps when Apollo called out, "Julia!" Julia Winters. She froze mid-stride, her shoulders tensing visibly. The 3 girls looked up at their mother, then turned curious gazes toward Apollo. After a moment that seemed to stretch forever, Julia slowly turned around. "Apollo," she acknowledged, her voice steady despite the turmoil evident in her eyes. Up close, the changes in her were more apparent. Her face was thinner, with shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of countless sleepless nights. Yet her posture remained proud, chin slightly lifted in the way he remembered so well. "I can't believe it's you," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. "After all this time." "Mom, who is this man?" asked one of the girls, tugging at Julia's sleeve. "Just someone I used to know," Julia answered, placing a protective arm around her daughter's shoulders. Apollo couldn't stop staring at the children. 3 identical faces with his blue eyes looked back at him with undisguised curiosity. "Your daughters are beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," Julia replied stiffly. "We need to go." "Wait, please," Apollo stepped forward. "Let me help you." Julia's expression hardened. "We're fine." "You don't look fine, Julia," he said gently. "Please, at least let me buy you all dinner." "We don't need your charity," she said, but her voice wavered slightly. One of the girls piped up, "Are you rich, mister? You have a really nice suit." "Isabella," Julia admonished softly. Apollo knelt to the child's level. "My name is Apollo, and yes, I suppose I am, though that's not what's important." "I'm Isabella," the girl replied. "These are my sisters, Rose and Olivia. We're triplets." "I can see that," Apollo smiled, his heart hammering in his chest. "How old are you?" "We're 6, Emma announced proudly. 6, not 6. Apollo did the math quickly. 5 years, plus 9 months. His mind reeled. The first drops of rain began to fall, pattering on the leaves above them. Julia glanced anxiously at the darkening sky. "What happened, Julia?" Apollo asked quietly, rising to his feet. "Please, talk to me." She hesitated, then sighed. "Life happened, Apollo. Not that you'd understand." "Try me," he challenged gently. Julia looked at her daughters, then back at him. "I had to come home from my fellowship in London when Dad got sick. Cancer. The treatments weren't covered by insurance. After 2 years of care, he died anyway." Her voice cracked slightly. "By then, my savings were gone, my career was stalled, and with 3 children to raise alone." "You never told me," Apollo said, the unspoken accusation hanging between them. "You made your choice 6 years ago," she replied, her words cutting through him. "We managed fine until recently. It's only been 3 months since we lost the apartment." The rain began falling harder. The girls huddled closer to their mother, their thin jackets offering little protection. "Julia, please," Apollo said, genuine concern in his voice. "At least let me get you all somewhere dry for tonight. No strings attached." "Mom, I'm cold," Sophie whispered. Julia looked torn, pride warring with practical necessity. After a long moment, she nodded reluctantly. "Just for tonight," she conceded. "And we're not accepting anything else." "Of course," Apollo agreed, relief washing over him. "My car is just across the street." As they walked toward his vehicle, Apollo's mind raced with questions. But for now, getting Julia and their daughters, his daughters, out of the rain was all that mattered. Apollo held the door open as Julia and the triplets entered the spacious apartment on the 15th floor of one of his newer buildings. The contrast between the gleaming marble foyer and Julia's worn appearance was stark. The girls, however, reacted with immediate delight. "Wow!" Olivia exclaimed, her eyes wide as she spun in a circle. "Is this a castle?" "It's so big," Rose whispered, clutching her small backpack to her chest. Isabella, the most reserved of the 3, kept close to her mother but couldn't hide her amazement. "Look at the windows, Mom. You can see the whole city." Julia stood rigid just inside the doorway, her discomfort evident in every line of her body. "This is excessive, Apollo." "It's just sitting empty until the lease starts next month," he said, trying to sound casual. "Make yourselves at home. The bathrooms are fully stocked and there are clean towels if you want to freshen up." "Can we take a bath, Mom?" Rose asked hopefully. "With bubbles?" Julia's expression softened as she looked at her daughter. "Yes, sweetheart. That would be nice." While Julia helped the girls get settled, Apollo ordered a variety of dishes from a nearby restaurant. When he returned to the living room, he found Julia standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the city lights. "Food should be here in 20 minutes, he said, keeping his distance. "I ordered a bit of everything since I wasn't sure what you all like." "The girls aren't picky," Julia replied. "They've learned to eat whatever's available." The simple statement hit Apollo like a physical blow. "Julia, what happened?" "The last I heard, you were taking the architecture world by storm in London." She turned from the window, her face half in shadow. "I was, for a while." She paused, collecting herself. "Then Dad was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. I came home immediately. The doctors gave him 6 months, but he fought for 2 years." "I'm sorry about your father," Apollo said sincerely. "He was always kind to me. He asked about you, you know, even near the end." Her voice was distant, as if recalling something from another lifetime. "By then, the medical bills had piled up. I sold everything, cashed out my retirement account, even mortgaged Dad's house. After he died, there was nothing left." From the bathroom came the sound of splashing and giggles. Julia's expression softened at the noise. "The girls have never known stability," she continued. We were doing okay until the company I was working for went under. Then the landlord doubled the rent. 3 months on the streets feels like 3 years. Apollo studied her profile, noting the strength still evident in her posture, despite everything. His gaze drifted to the bathroom door, where he could hear the triplets playing. There was something about their eyes, their smiles. "They look like you," he said without thinking. Julia's head snapped toward him, her expression suddenly guarded. "They have my hair," she said carefully. "But those eyes—" Apollo began, then shook his head. It had to be coincidence. The timing didn't make sense with how they'd ended things. While Julia helped the girls dress after their bath, Apollo noticed a worn sketchbook peeking from her backpack. Curiosity got the better of him. He flipped it open to find page after page of architectural drawings, innovative, sustainable housing designs unlike anything he'd seen before. "You shouldn't look through people's things," Julia's voice came from behind him. Apollo turned, the sketchbook still open in his hands. "These are incredible, Julia. You haven't lost your touch." She quickly took the book from him, her fingers brushing his. "Just daydreams. Not much use when you're trying to find your next meal. But this concept for affordable modular housing, it's brilliant." "It doesn't matter," she said, closing the book firmly. "That life is over for me." "It doesn't have to be," Apollo insisted. "Some dreams don't get second chances, Apollo," Julia replied, her voice tinged with a bitterness that spoke volumes about her disappointment. "Architecture was my passion, but my priorities changed. The girls need stability, not their mother chasing ghosts." The doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of dinner and saving Julia from further discussion. But as Apollo watched her tuck the sketchbook away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was seeing the real Julia for the first time in years. Her brilliance, her sacrifice, and the dreams she'd been forced to abandon. Over the next several days, Apollo found himself creating excuses to spend time with Julia and the girls. He'd secured them a comfortable 2-bedroom apartment in one of his mid-range properties. Nice enough to be safe and comfortable, but not so luxurious that Julia would refuse it on principle. He told himself it was just temporary assistance for an old friend in need, but the truth was simpler. He couldn't stay away. Each of the triplets had distinct personalities that captivated him. Isabella, the protective one, watched him with careful eyes, measuring his every move around her mother and sisters. Olivia bombarded him with questions about everything from his watch to why buildings had elevators. And Rose, the quietest, would sometimes slip her small hand into his when they walked, a gesture that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. On Wednesday afternoon, Apollo arrived with groceries and found the apartment filled with the scent of baking. "We're making cookies," Olivia announced, her face and clothes dusted with flour. "I can see that," Apollo laughed, setting down the bags. "Looks like you're wearing most of the ingredients." Julia emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "It's been ages since we've had a proper kitchen." The girls wanted to celebrate. Apollo noticed how she looked more rested now, some of the tension easing from her face. She'd tied her hair back, revealing the elegant line of her neck that he remembered so well. "Can I help?" he asked. "You can help me tie my shoes," Rose said, patting over in sock feet and holding up her sneakers. "I'm still learning." Apollo knelt down, taking the tiny pink sneakers. "It's tricky at first, but you'll get it." "Mommy says I'm getting better," Rose said proudly. "She says I'm persistent. That means I don't give up." "That's a good quality to have," Apollo replied, demonstrating the loop slowly. "Mommy says I got that from my daddy," Rose continued innocently. "She says I got lots of things from him, like my birthday." Apollo's fingers froze on the shoelace. "Your birthday?" "Uh-huh. October 12th. Mommy says that's the same as my daddy's birthday. Isn't that cool?" October 12th. His birthday. Apollo's mind raced through calculations. If the girls were 5 and they shared his birthday, his heart hammered against his ribs as he finished tying Rose's shoes with unsteady hands. Throughout dinner and the bedtime routine that followed, Apollo moved in a daze, watching the girls with new eyes. The blue eyes that matched his own. The way Olivia tilted her head when curious, exactly as his mother always said he did. Isabella's determined jaw. Rose's thoughtful pauses. After the girls were asleep, he found Julia washing dishes in the kitchen. "October 12th, he said quietly. She stilled, her back to him, hands submerged in soapy water. "Rose mentioned it's their birthday, and mine." Julia's shoulders tensed. "She talks a lot." "Julia." His voice cracked slightly. "Are they mine?" The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft dripping of water as Julia withdrew her hands from the sink and reached for a towel. "Yes," she finally said, turning to face him. "They're yours." The confirmation hit him like a physical blow, though he'd already known the truth. "Why didn't you tell me? All these years." "I tried." Her voice was tight with old pain. "When I found out I was pregnant, I called you for weeks. Your number was disconnected. I went to your family's house and your father told me you wanted nothing to do with me, or..." She gestured toward the bedroom where the girls slept. "Our situation." "My father?" Apollo felt sick. "He never told me. I never knew." "Would it have mattered?" Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Of course it would have mattered. The force of his response surprised them both. "They're my daughters, Julia. I've missed 5 years of their lives." That night, Apollo didn't sleep. He paced his empty penthouse, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd learned. 3 daughters. His daughters. Their entire lives had passed without him while he'd been building luxury condos and chasing hollow success. By dawn, one thing was clear. Everything had changed. His priorities, his future, his entire understanding of his past, all transformed in a single moment by 3 little girls with his eyes and birthday. Apollo stared out his penthouse window as dawn broke over Boston, his mind replaying the confrontation with Julia over and over. The truth had shattered everything he thought he knew about the past 5 years. Fragments of memory surfaced, his father appearing unexpectedly at his college apartment that final week with Julia, the urgent family business that had pulled him away, the subsequent weeks when his calls to Julia went unanswered, leading him to believe she'd moved on. His father had orchestrated it all, keeping Apollo's daughters from him. "Damn it!" He slammed his fist against the window frame. The betrayal cut deep, not just for himself, but for what Julia had endured alone. Pregnant, abandoned, and then the years of struggle that followed. By 7 a.m., he'd showered, changed, and was heading back to the apartment with a new determination. Julia hadn't slept either. She sat at the kitchen table, a cold cup of tea between her palms, her stomach twisted with anxiety. What had she done? In her current situation, homeless, jobless, would Apollo use his wealth and influence to take the girls? The thought made her physically ill. When his knock came, she nearly jumped out of her skin. Apollo stood in the doorway, dark circles under his eyes matching her own. "Can we talk?" She nodded, letting him in. The girls were still asleep, exhausted from yesterday's excitement. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sorry for what my father did. I'm sorry you went through everything alone." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. "I didn't tell you to make you feel guilty." "I know, but I am." He ran a hand through his hair. "Julia, I want to know them. I want to be their father, if you'll let me." Before she could respond, a small voice called from the hallway. "Mommy?" Isabella stood there, her face flushed and pajamas rumpled. "I don't feel good." Julia rushed to her daughter, pressing a hand to her forehead. "You're burning up, sweetheart." Apollo moved beside them, concern etched across his face. "What can I do?" "The medicine bag, in the bathroom," Julia said, lifting Isabella into her arms. Within minutes, Isabella's condition worsened, her fever spiking, her breathing labored. When she began whimpering about pain in her stomach, Apollo didn't hesitate. "We need to get her to a hospital. My car's downstairs." 20 minutes later, they rushed through emergency room doors, Apollo carrying Isabella while Julia held her hand, murmuring reassurances. The receptionist looked up, taking in the disheveled woman, the well-dressed man, and the crying child. "Relationship to the patient?" she asked, looking between them. "We're her parents," Apollo answered without hesitation. The woman's eyes flickered with doubt. "Both of you?" "Yes," Julia said firmly. "We're her parents." More questions followed as they filled out forms. Insurance information that Julia didn't have but Apollo provided. Medical history that only Julia knew. They moved together like dancers finding an old rhythm, each supplying what the other couldn't. When the doctor diagnosed Isabella with a severe ear infection and dehydration, the relief was palpable. As Isabella dozed on a hospital bed receiving IV fluids and antibiotics, Apollo and Julia sat side by side in uncomfortable plastic chairs. "Remember that time in college when you got food poisoning?" Julia asked suddenly, breaking the tense silence. A small smile tugged at Apollo's lips. "From that sketchy seafood place you insisted was authentic." "It was authentic. Authentically terrible." Julia laughed softly. "You were so dramatic." "I thought I was dying," Apollo protested, his eyes crinkling. "You made me chicken soup from scratch. And you proposed to me over the toilet bowl." "I was delirious," Apollo chuckled, then sobered. "I meant it, though." Their eyes met, the shared memory hanging between them, a glimpse of what might have been. "What happens now, Apollo?" Julia asked quietly, glancing at Isabella's sleeping form. "I don't know exactly," he admitted, "but I want to be part of their lives, and..." He hesitated. "I'd like the chance to know you again, too." For the first time in 5 years, Julia's smile reached her eyes. "I think I'd like that." Isabella stirred, breaking the moment. They both moved to her bedside, their hands accidentally brushing as they reached to comfort their daughter. Neither pulled away. The days following Isabella's hospital stay brought a whirlwind of change. Apollo secured a comfortable 2-bedroom apartment for Julia and the girls, insisting they accept it while they figured out longer-term arrangements. He visited daily, getting to know his daughters and rebuilding fragile trust with Julia. Each day, his anger toward his father grew like a dark storm gathering strength. One evening, while watching the triplets build a pillow fort in the living room, Apollo made a spontaneous decision. "Have dinner with me tomorrow night," he said to Julia. "All of you, at my place." Julia hesitated. "Apollo." "Please," he said, his voice softening. "I want to cook for you." Her eyebrows shot up. "You cook?" "There's a lot you don't know about me after 12 years, he replied with a small smile. 7 o'clock? The next evening, Apollo paced his penthouse, checking the dining table setting for the 3rd time. The lasagna, his specialty, was nearly ready, and fresh bread warmed in the oven. When the elevator announced their arrival, his heart raced like a teenager's. The girls burst into his apartment with excited energy, their matching sundresses twirling as they explored the spacious penthouse. Julia followed more cautiously, wearing a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes. "You look beautiful," Apollo said quietly. Julia blushed. "This place is amazing." "Mommy, look at the view," Rose called, pressing her nose against the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Careful, sweetheart," Julia warned, moving toward her daughter. Apollo guided them through a tour before dinner, enjoying their reactions to his home. When they reached the kitchen, Olivia's eyes widened at the sight of the massive island covered with cooking ingredients. "You really made dinner," she asked skeptically. I really did, Apollo laughed, lifting her onto a stool. Want to help me with the salad? Dinner was a revelation for Julia. She watched Apollo interact with their daughters, slicing Isabella's lasagna into tiny pieces, complimenting Rose's story about a cloud that looked like an elephant, listening intently to Olivia's detailed explanation of her favorite book. This domestic, patient man was a version of Apollo she'd never known existed. This is delicious, Julia admitted, savoring another bite. Apollo's smile was warm. My grandmother taught me. After college, I was lost for a while. Cooking with her helped. After dinner, he suggested a movie. Within 30 minutes, all three girls were fast asleep, curled together on his oversized sofa. They're exhausted, Julia whispered. Should we move them? Apollo shook his head. Let them sleep. Come outside with me. He led her to the balcony, where the Boston skyline glittered beneath a clear night sky. Apollo poured 2 glasses of wine and joined her at the railing. I keep thinking about what my father did, he said, his voice hardening. 12 years, Julia. He stole 12 years from us, from me and my daughters. Julia sipped her wine. What will you do? I don't know yet, but I can't forgive this. His knuckles whitened around his glass. When I think of you struggling alone, pregnant, then raising them without support. We survived, she said simply. Apollo turned to face her. Did you ever try to contact me again? After that first time? Once when they were born. Julia's eyes reflected the city lights. I sent pictures to your old email. When there was no response, I decided it was better for the girls not to grow up hoping for someone who didn't want them. I would have wanted them, Apollo whispered fiercely. I would have wanted you. The admission hung between them like a tangible thing. I never stopped loving you entirely, he confessed. I tried. God knows I tried. Julia's breath caught. I used to imagine telling you about them. What you'd say, how you'd look at them. Sometimes I'd see a man who looked like you from behind, and my heart would stop. Apollo moved closer, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Julia. Their eyes met, 12 years of separation dissolving in the starlight. Apollo leaned forward, his lips meeting hers in a tentative kiss. Julia froze momentarily before softening against him, her hand finding his chest. The kiss deepened, years of unspoken longing flowing between them until a small voice called from inside. Mommy! They broke apart, both breathing heavily. Olivia stood in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. I'm coming, sweetheart, Julia said, her voice unsteady. She glanced back at Apollo, her eyes full of confused emotion, before she turned to attend to their daughter. The next evening found Apollo at Montrose's, an exclusive restaurant downtown, seated across from his father and 2 potential investors. The conversation flowed around him, market projections, profit margins, expansion plans, but Apollo barely heard it. His mind was filled with images of his daughter's smiles, Julia's lips against his, and the searing knowledge of his father's betrayal. Apollo? His father's sharp voice cut through his thoughts. Mr. Watkins asked you a question. Apollo looked up, meeting his father's cold, calculating eyes, the eyes of a man who had deliberately kept him from his children. I apologize, Apollo said, struggling to maintain his composure. My mind was elsewhere. Mr. Watkins was asking about the demographic research for the Riverfront project, Apollo's father prompted, his smile tight with irritation. Apollo stared at his father's familiar face, the face of a man who had lied to him for 5 years. Something inside him snapped. Actually, Apollo said, setting down his fork with deliberate calm, I'd like to discuss a different matter entirely. His father's eyes narrowed in warning. This isn't the time, Apollo. It's exactly the time. Apollo turned to the investors. Gentlemen, I apologize, But I've recently discovered something that changes everything about my life and this company's future. Apollo, his father hissed. Stop this immediately. 3 days ago, I discovered I have 3 6-year-old daughters I never knew existed. Apollo's voice grew stronger with each word. Their mother, the woman I loved in college, tried to tell me about the pregnancy, but my father intercepted her, told her I wanted nothing to do with her or the babies, and sent her away. The table fell silent. Mr. Watkins and his partner exchanged uncomfortable glances. This is hardly appropriate dinner conversation, Apollo's father said, attempting to salvage the situation. My son is experiencing some personal issues. Personal issues? Apollo laughed bitterly. You stole my children from me. You watched me build empty luxury properties while their mother, a brilliant architect, struggled to keep them housed. His father leaned forward, voice low and dangerous. I did what was necessary to protect our family legacy. She wasn't suitable. No connections, no fortune. You were 22 and infatuated. I made a business decision. A business decision. Apollo stood slowly. My daughters aren't a business decision. They're my legacy, the only one that matters now. Sit down, his father commanded. You're throwing away everything we've built. Apollo looked at the investors. I apologize, gentlemen, but I need to be with my family tonight. And moving forward, Reed Development will be taking a different direction, one that includes affordable housing projects designed by their mother. He placed his napkin on the table and walked out, ignoring his father's angry calls behind him. Across town, Julia stared at the email on her phone in disbelief. Thornton and Associates, one of Boston's most prestigious architecture firms, wanted to interview her tomorrow. The message referenced her impressive portfolio and innovative sustainable housing concepts. Her portfolio, the one Apollo had seen in her sketchbook. When Apollo arrived at her apartment an hour later, she confronted him immediately. Did you send my designs to Thornton and Associates? She demanded. Apollo's hesitation was answer enough. I just made a call. Your work deserved to be seen. That wasn't your decision to make. Julia's hands trembled. I'm not a charity case, Apollo. I don't need you pulling strings for me. I wasn't trying to... Yes, you were. Julia paced the small living room. This is exactly what I was afraid of. You swoop in with your money and connections, rearranging our lives without asking. Apollo ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Is it so wrong to want to help? You're talented, Julia. You always were. And I need to rebuild my life on my own terms, she insisted. How can we have any kind of equal relationship if you're always the one with the power, the money, the influence? Her words hung between them, exposing the uncomfortable reality of their situation. I just walked away from a major investment deal, Apollo said quietly. I confronted my father about what he did to us. I chose you, all of you, over everything else. Julia's expression softened slightly. That doesn't mean you get to make decisions about my career. Before Apollo could respond, the apartment door burst open and their daughters tumbled in from their neighbor's apartment. Daddy, Rose exclaimed, running to Apollo. Mrs. Peterson, let us make cookies. Apollo knelt to embrace her, the argument with Julia momentarily suspended. Over the next hour, he focused entirely on the girls, helping Isabella with her math homework, listening to Olivia read from her favorite book, and teaching Rose how to play thumb war. Tomorrow, he promised Rose, we'll go to the park and I'll show you how to skip rocks on the pond. My dad taught me when I was your age. Really? Rose's eyes lit up. Just you and me? Just you and me, Apollo confirmed, creating their first special ritual. With Olivia, he made plans to visit the library to find more books by her favorite author. For Isabella, he promised to help build the science project she'd been struggling with. Julia watched from the kitchen doorway, her anger fading as she observed these small, meaningful connections forming. The tension between them remained unresolved, but seeing Apollo commit to fatherhood with such genuine enthusiasm made her heart ache with complicated emotion. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning. Julia stood frozen in the doorway, the official documents trembling in her hands. The language was cold and clinical, but the message was devastatingly clear. Apollo's father was challenging her custody of the girls, citing her extended period of homelessness and inability to provide adequate shelter and necessities as evidence of her unfitness as a mother. "This can't be happening," she whispered, sinking onto the couch. When Apollo arrived that afternoon, she thrust the papers at him without a word. His face drained of color as he read. "Julia, I swear I had nothing to do with this. Didn't you?" Her voice was hollow. "You've been taking pictures of the girls constantly, building evidence, getting to know their routines before you take them away." "No." Apollo knelt before her, his eyes desperate. "My father did this. After I walked out of that dinner, he threatened to fix things his way. I never thought he'd go this far." Julia turned away, arms wrapped protectively around herself. "Your promises meant nothing. I never should have trusted you." "Look at me," Apollo pleaded. "I will fight this with everything I have. Not against you, but with you. Those girls need their mother." She met his gaze, searching for any hint of deception. "How do I know you won't change your mind when your father offers you back your company?" "Because nothing matters more to me than our daughters, and nothing matters more to them than you." He reached for her hand. "We'll fight him together." Over the next week, they prepared their defense. Apollo hired the city's best family attorney while they gathered evidence of Julia's dedication despite their circumstances. "We need to document everything," their lawyer advised. "Every sacrifice you made, every effort to maintain stability." Late one night, as they organized paperwork at Julia's kitchen table, Apollo noticed her growing increasingly quiet. "What is it?" he asked gently. Julia stared at her daughter's school records, perfect attendance despite everything. "There's so much you don't know about before." "Tell me," Apollo said. She took a deep breath. "When we first lost our apartment, I was too ashamed to ask for help. We lived in our car for 2 weeks. Her voice cracked. "I'd park near the library so the girls could use the bathroom and do homework. I'd wash them in public restrooms at dawn before anyone came in." Apollo reached for her hand, but stayed silent, letting her continue. "When winter came, I couldn't let them freeze. We found shelters, but they were often full or unsafe." Julia wiped away a tear. "So I'd work cleaning offices at night while the girls slept in the break room. I'd tell them it was a special sleepover." "How did you manage their schooling?" Apollo asked softly. "I never let them miss a day, never. I'd walk them 5 miles if the bus money ran out." Pride flickered across her face. "Their teachers never knew. I volunteered in their classrooms so no one would suspect." She showed him a small notebook filled with meticulous budgeting, every penny tracked, every meal planned. "Some days I didn't eat so they could have enough. I sold my father's watch, the last thing I had of his, to buy Isabella's asthma medication." Apollo's eyes filled with tears. "And you still found time to draw those designs." "At night, after they slept, it kept me sane, kept me hoping." She looked up at him. "I never let them see me cry, never let them feel unsafe. They knew we had challenges, but I protected them from understanding how bad things really were." Apollo moved his chair beside hers and gently pulled her into his arms. "You are the most extraordinary person I've ever known," he whispered against her hair. "My father doesn't stand a chance against your strength." For the first time, Julia didn't pull away from his embrace. Instead, she let herself lean into him, accepting his support. "We'll show the court everything, Apollo promised. Every sacrifice, every miracle you perform to keep them safe and happy despite impossible circumstances. Julia nodded against his shoulder. I would do anything for them. I know, Apollo said. And that's exactly why you're the parent they need most. As the custody hearing date loomed on the calendar, Apollo found himself besieged from all sides. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from investors threatening to pull out of ongoing projects. The latest came from Westbrook Development, his largest partner. Mr. Reed, given the current family situation and your public break with Reed Sr., we're reconsidering our position on the Harborview project. Apollo set his phone face down on his desk and rubbed his temples. The Harborview project represented nearly 30% of his company's annual revenue. Without it, he'd be forced to lay off staff and might not recover financially for years. His assistant knocked lightly on his office door. Your father is here to see you. Apollo's jaw tightened. Send him in. Gerald Reed entered with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting his way. He settled into the chair opposite Apollo without waiting for an invitation. You look terrible, son. This domestic drama is clearly taking its toll. What do you want? Apollo asked flatly. Gerald smiled thinly. To offer you a way out of this mess. He leaned forward. I've spoken with our family attorneys. They've prepared a reasonable custody arrangement. You get the girls 3 days a week, alternate holidays. Julia keeps them the rest of the time, provided she maintains suitable living arrangements. Suitable according to whom? Apollo asked, his voice dangerously quiet. To the court, of course. Gerald waved his hand dismissively. I'll withdraw my petition questioning her fitness, and you'll be able to salvage your business relationships. Apollo studied his father's face. And what's the catch? No catch. You simply need to file for partial custody yourself. Position yourself as the stable, financially secure parent. Your relationship with their mother can remain cordial but distant. Gerald smiled. You get your daughters, keep your fortune, and that woman gets enough support to live comfortably. Everyone wins. Apollo stood slowly, placing both palms flat on his desk. That woman has a name. Julia, the mother of my children. The woman you deliberately kept from me for 12 years. I did what was necessary for whom? Apollo's voice rose. Not for me. Certainly not for my daughters. You robbed us all of years we can never get back. Gerald's expression hardened. Don't be dramatic. I'm offering you everything. Your children, your business, your legacy. No, Apollo said quietly. You're offering me the same empty life I've been living. Success without meaning. Wealth without love. He walked to the door and opened it. I choose them. All of them. Julia included. You're making a terrible mistake, Gerald warned, rising from his chair. The only mistake I made was letting you dictate my life for so long. Apollo held the door wider. Goodbye, father. After Gerald left, Apollo called his attorney to prepare for the upcoming hearing. His resolve had never been stronger. That evening, Apollo arrived at Julia's apartment to find her surrounded by architectural sketches. She looked up with a mixture of excitement and anxiety in her eyes. I got the job, she said. Associate architect at Caldwell and Partners. Julia, that's wonderful. Apollo moved to embrace her, then hesitated, noticing her expression. Isn't it? She gathered her sketches, hands trembling slightly. It is. It's been so long since I practiced professionally. What if I can't do it anymore? What if I've lost whatever talent I had? Apollo gestured to her drawings. These prove otherwise. Drawings are one thing. Actually executing designs, working with clients, meeting deadlines while caring for the girls. She shook her head. I'm terrified of failing. Apollo sat beside her on the couch. You won't fail. You're the woman who kept 3 children fed, educated, and loved through impossible circumstances. This job will be the easy part." Julia smiled faintly, then grew serious. "Apollo, with the hearing so close, there's something we need to talk about. Something we've been avoiding." "What happened 5 years ago?" he said quietly. She nodded. "I need to understand. When I told you I was pregnant—" "I never got that message," Apollo interrupted, pain etching his features. "My father intercepted your calls. He told me you'd taken the fellowship in Spain and didn't want to be tied down to me. And I was told you wanted to focus on your career, that a family would hold you back." Julia's eyes filled with tears. "I tried so hard to reach you." "I would have been there," Apollo whispered, taking her hands in his. "For you. For them. From the very first moment." "I believe you," Julia said softly. "I think I always knew something wasn't right about how things ended." Apollo reached up to brush a tear from her cheek. "We lost 12 years, but we don't have to lose another day." Their eyes held for a long moment before Julia leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with years of longing finally given voice. When they parted, Apollo rested his forehead against hers. "I never stopped loving you," he confessed. "Not really." "Neither did I," Julia whispered back, "despite everything." One afternoon, the courtroom buzzed with tension as Judge Elaine Montgomery reviewed the documents before her. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting stark shadows across the polished wood of the judge's bench. Apollo sat beside his attorney at one table, while Julia occupied the other with her lawyer, a pro bono counsel from a women's advocacy group. Gerald Reed sat behind his legal team, his expression coldly confident. "Before we proceed further," Judge Montgomery said, "I understand the petitioner wishes to address the court." Apollo stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Yes, Your Honor." He walked to the center of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. He turned to face not only the judge, but the entire gallery. "Your Honor, I'd like to withdraw my petition for custody." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Gerald's face darkened. "Furthermore," Apollo continued, "I wish to submit evidence that demonstrates a pattern of manipulation by my father, Gerald Reed, that directly resulted in the separation of my family for 12 years. His attorney approached with a thick folder of documents, which the bailiff delivered to the judge. These records include phone transcripts, witness statements, and correspondence proving that my father deliberately prevented communication between myself and Ms. Winters when she attempted to inform me of her pregnancy." The judge flipped through the pages, her expression grave. "I've also brought witnesses who can testify to the nature of our relationship before this interference," Apollo added. Judge Montgomery nodded. "Proceed." 3 of Apollo and Julia's college friends took the stand in succession, each describing the devoted couple they had known. How Apollo had spoken of building a future with Julia, how they had planned to travel together after graduation. "They were inseparable," testified Emma Chen, their former classmate. "When Julia suddenly left without saying goodbye to Apollo, none of us could believe it. It was completely out of character for both of them." After the witnesses, Apollo again addressed the court. "Your Honor, I stand before you today to make my position absolutely clear." He turned to face his father directly. "I hereby renounce any claim to the Reed family inheritance or business connections that come with strings attached." Gerald half rose from his seat, shock evident on his face. "True family values can't be measured in dollars," Apollo continued, his voice strengthening. "They're measured in love, commitment, and the courage to stand by those who matter most. For 5 years I lived with wealth, but without the family I never knew I had. I choose them now, without reservation." He looked at Julia, whose eyes shimmered with tears. "I choose them, even if it means starting over completely." Judge Montgomery studied Apollo for a long moment before turning to Gerald Reed. "Mr. Reed, given the evidence presented and your grandson's statement, Do you wish to continue with your petition challenging Ms. Winter's fitness as a mother? Gerald's attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but he brushed the man aside. This is a family matter that has clearly gotten out of hand, Gerald said stiffly. I withdraw my petition. Then this case is dismissed, Judge Montgomery declared, bringing down her gavel with finality. That evening, Apollo, Julia, and the girls celebrated their victory with pizza in Julia's small apartment. The triplets, exhausted by the day's events but sensing the adults' relief, fell asleep early on the pull-out couch. After tucking them in, Apollo joined Julia at her small kitchen table, where she poured them each a glass of inexpensive wine. To freedom, she said, raising her glass. To family, he countered, clinking his glass against hers. They drank in comfortable silence before Apollo sighed. I should tell you, 3 investors pulled out this afternoon. The downtown project is on the verge of collapse. Julia set down her glass. Because of today? Word travels fast in business circles. Without my father's backing, they're nervous. He shrugged. I don't regret it for a second, but I need to be honest about where we stand. Julia bit her lip, then stood. Wait here. She disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a large portfolio case. With careful movements, she spread several architectural drawings across the table. What's this? Apollo asked, leaning forward. I've been working on these after the girls go to sleep, Julia explained, her fingers tracing the lines of a building design. It's a concept for sustainable modular housing that costs roughly 40% less to build than traditional construction. Apollo studied the plans with growing amazement. These are brilliant, Julia. The designs use prefabricated components but allow for customization. They're energy efficient, built with renewable materials, and, most importantly, affordable for working families. Her eyes shone with passion. Families like mine was before everything fell apart. Apollo looked up at her, understanding dawning. You're suggesting a complete pivot for your business, she confirmed. Luxury developments have their place, but there's a massive untapped market for quality, affordable housing. With your development experience and my designs, she hesitated. We could help people who are one crisis away from where I was when you found me. Apollo stood and walked around the table, taking her hands in his. This isn't just about saving my business, is it? It's about building something meaningful, Julia said softly. Together. Apollo gazed at the sleeping faces of their daughters, then back at the innovative designs spread before them. It's perfect, he whispered. Absolutely perfect. The conference room buzzed with tension as Apollo stood before the construction team, presenting Julia's revolutionary designs. Blueprints and 3D renderings covered the table, showcasing the transformation of what was once planned as luxury condominiums into an affordable housing community. The modular construction reduces build time by 30%, Apollo explained, pointing to the timeline projection. And the solar integration means residents will see significantly lower utility costs. Marcus Chen, his longtime project manager, frowned. Apollo, we've never built anything like this. Our crew specializes in high-end finishes. Which is why we'll bring in specialized training, Julia interjected, stepping forward. Her confidence had grown exponentially since starting their partnership. These homes may be affordable, but they'll still reflect quality craftsmanship. The difference is in the innovative materials and construction methods. After the meeting, Apollo found Julia in what had become their shared office, reviewing supplier contracts. That went better than expected, he said, closing the door behind him. Julia looked up with a tired smile. Only 3 people threatened to quit. Progress, Apollo laughed, then grew serious. The bank called. They've reduced our construction loan by 20%. Your father's influence? Almost certainly. Apollo sat beside her. But we'll make it work. We always do. At home that evening, their small apartment hummed with domestic activity. Rose sat at Apollo's feet, solemnly instructing him on the proper way to braid her doll's hair. In the kitchen, Isabella helped Julia prepare dinner, standing on a step stool to reach the counter. "Daddy, you're doing it wrong," Rose sighed, taking the doll from his hands. "Like this." Apollo watched in amazement as her tiny fingers deftly wove the strands together. "When did you get so good at this?" "Mommy taught me," she said simply. From across the room, Olivia looked up from her picture book. "Can we go see the big building tomorrow? The one you and Mommy are making?" "It's Saturday, so yes," Apollo confirmed. "You can help me measure things." Olivia beamed. Of the three girls, she had shown the most interest in construction, constantly asking questions about how buildings were made. Later, after the girls were asleep, Apollo found Julia at the kitchen table, working on refinements to their designs. "They're thriving," he said softly, massaging her shoulders. "Isabella actually smiled at me twice today." Julia leaned back against him. "She's the toughest critic. You've earned those smiles." "I never imagined this life," Apollo admitted, "but now I can't imagine any other." The following weeks brought both challenges and breakthroughs. Word spread through Boston's business community that Gerald Reed had warned potential investors against backing his son's misguided charity project. 3 more investors pulled funding, leaving Apollo scrambling to cover payroll. "We could downsize the first phase," Julia suggested during a late-night strategy session. "Focus on completing just the east section." Apollo shook his head. "If we scale back now, it validates my father's claims that this isn't viable." The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Catherine Zhang, CEO of a major sustainable technology company, arrived unannounced at their construction site one rainy Tuesday. "I've heard interesting things about what you're doing here," she said, accepting a hard hat from Apollo. "Some good, some concerning. I prefer to see for myself." Julia led the tour, explaining the innovative features that made the homes both sustainable and affordable. Catherine asked pointed questions about materials, energy efficiency, and return on investment. As they reached the partially completed community center, Catherine stopped. "Your father contacted me last week, Mr. Reed. He suggested this project was doomed to fail." Apollo tensed, but before he could respond, Catherine continued. "I grew up in public housing. Not everyone has the luxury of starting from advantage." She surveyed the construction site. "I'm prepared to offer financing for the completion of this project, with first rights to invest in your next 3 developments." That evening, they celebrated the news with the girls, who didn't understand the financial details but caught their parents' excitement. "Does this mean we can have a bigger house?" Isabella asked practically. Apollo and Julia exchanged glances. They had discussed moving but hadn't mentioned it to the girls yet. "Actually," Apollo said, kneeling to their level, "I was thinking maybe I could move in here. Would that be okay with you 3? Olivia immediately threw her arms around his neck, while Rose nodded enthusiastically. Isabella, ever the cautious one, studied him seriously. "Forever?" she asked. "Forever," Apollo confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. Isabella's face broke into a rare, full smile. "Okay then." 3 weeks later, Apollo officially moved in, bringing only his essential belongings. That night, after the girls were asleep, he and Julia stood in their small kitchen, his boxes still piled in corners. "It's crowded," Julia acknowledged. "It's perfect," Apollo countered, pulling her close. "We have everything we need right here." 1 year later, the spring sunshine bathed the nearly completed Reed Winters community in golden light. What had once been Apollo's luxury development site now stood as Boston's most innovative affordable housing project. The buildings formed a horseshoe around a central courtyard, their facades a blend of modern efficiency and welcoming warmth, just like the partnership that had created them. Apollo guided Julia through the property, her hand in his as they walked the paths they'd designed together. "Remember when you first showed me your sketches?" Apollo asked, squeezing her hand. I knew right then that your vision was exactly what I'd been missing all those years. Julia smiled, her eyes taking in the details that had once existed only in her imagination. And I thought you were just being nice to the homeless woman with the cute kids. Those cute kids being mine was certainly a shock, Apollo chuckled. Best shock of my life. They passed the playground where several workers were installing the final pieces of equipment. Beyond it stood the community center with its glass walls and solar roof. Julia's design that had impressed Catherine Zhang and secured their financing when they needed it most. The families move in next week, Julia said, her voice full of quiet pride. 37 families who won't have to worry about stable housing anymore. Apollo nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. Including Maria and her boys from the shelter you stayed in. They continued walking, Apollo subtly checking his watch. The timing needed to be perfect. I still can't believe how much has changed in a year, Julia said, looking around at the buildings. From that park bench to this. From strangers to family, Apollo added. They approached the central courtyard, Julia's masterpiece. Unlike traditional developments that treated common areas as afterthoughts, she had designed this space as the heart of the community. Curved benches created conversation nooks, a small amphitheater would host community events, and planters were ready for the garden club Julia had already organized among future residents. This is my favorite spot, Julia said, stepping into the center where a circular stone pattern radiated outward like ripples in water. From here, you can see how everything connects. Apollo took a deep breath. That's exactly why I wanted to bring you here today. He glanced toward a cluster of serviceberry trees where, if he squinted, he could just make out Olivia's blue dress as she fidgeted in their hiding spot. Right on time. Julia, he began, taking both her hands in his. 1 year ago, I was a successful man by society's standards, but an empty one by any measure that truly matters. I had buildings, but no home. I had business associates, but no real connection. Julia's eyes widened as she began to understand what was happening. Then I saw you across that park, and my whole world realigned. Apollo's voice grew husky with emotion. You and our incredible daughters showed me what family really means. You challenged me to build something that matters, something that helps others find the stability we've found together. He dropped to one knee on the stone circle, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Julia Winters, you are the blueprint for everything good in my life. Will you marry me? Tears spilled down Julia's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Yes, she finally managed. Yes, Apollo. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, a sapphire surrounded by 3 small diamonds for their daughters, excited squeals erupted from behind the trees. Isabella, Olivia, and Rose came running across the courtyard, unable to contain themselves any longer. Did she say yes? Did she say yes? Rose called, her voice carrying across the space. She said yes, Apollo confirmed, scooping Rose up as she reached them. Olivia and Isabella crashed into their mother, nearly knocking her over in their excitement. More figures emerged from hiding places. Catherine Zhang, Apollo's project manager Sam, Julia's colleagues from the architecture firm, and several families who would soon call this community home. You knew about this? Julia asked the girls, laughing through her tears. We helped pick the ring, Isabella announced proudly. And we practiced being super quiet, added Olivia. Maria, who had become a close friend during their shared journey from homelessness to stability, approached with a small tree in a pot. We thought you might want to plant this today, she said, handing it to Apollo. A new beginning. Apollo looked questioningly at Julia, who nodded in understanding. They had discussed planting a ceremonial tree when the community was completed, but this moment felt perfect. Together, the family moved to the prepared spot in the courtyard. Workers had already dug the hole, and a small plaque waited beside it. Read Winter's family tree, where second chances take root. Apollo and Julia held the young oak steady while their daughters took turns shoveling soil around its base. Friends and future neighbors gathered around, witnessing this symbol of new life and growth. From strangers to family, Julia echoed Apollo's earlier words, her new ring catching the sunlight. From a park bench to a home for dozens of families. Apollo wrapped his arm around her waist. Their daughters clustered around them as they admired their handiwork. The tree stood small but sturdy, ready to grow alongside the community they had built, a living testament to what could flourish when given a second chance. If you enjoyed this story, I've found another special one just for you. Our community can't stop talking about how heartwarming and moving it is. Click on the video in front of you to experience this beautiful story before it's gone.